Hi everyone, my name is Maddie, welcome back to my channel and welcome to this video where I'm going to be doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader book tag. So this was a tag created by Maddie over at the Book Pusher, who of course be linked below as will the original video, and I think it was based off the Get to Know the Romance Reader book tag originally, but it's basically just a series of questions to get to know someone's taste in fantasy, how they got into fantasy and all of that. So I'm going to get straight into it and hopefully not take too long to answer it, because looking at the questions I can definitely see this being the sort of thing I get into a lot of long discussions for and then end up with a very long video. But hopefully I will keep this short and sweet. So the first question is your fantasy origin story. How did you get into reading fantasy? What brought you to reading your first fantasy novel? And this is kind of difficult for me because honestly, I don't really remember. When I was really young and reading, I definitely didn't really read fantasy, or at least not knowingly. I read a lot of sort of animal arc books and things like that, so definitely not fantasy. And then when I was reading as a teenager, I typically started with John Green and stuff, but very quickly moved into YA dystopia. So Hunger Games and Divergent were absolutely my favourite things. And I even read things like Slated, so slightly fantastical and paranormal YA books, but I do remember one of the first books I read was Before I Fall by Lauren Oliver, which I've always kind of considered a contemporary story. But in fact, it does actually have a fantasy element because it talks about someone repeating the same day. So I have always had a leaning towards that style of book. But in terms of actual fantasy, I don't know. But back when I was reading sort of dystopian and paranormal and things like that, even years ago, I never read just straight fantasy. I did read some sort of urban fantasy, like I read some of the City of Bones series by Alexandra Clare, I read House of Night by PC and Kristen Cast, but never straight fantasy. So I think it'd probably be when I was about 18 or 19 when I got back into reading that I actually read my first proper fantasy book. And the first few I read that were more towards what I read now, though they were actually more fabulism and still urban fantasy, were The Raven Cycle and All the Crooked Saints by Maggie Stiefvater. I then moved on to The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which is relatively fantasy-ish, though again with a kind of normal setting. But I think honestly the first series I read, which had a truly otherworld setting, was Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, which I can't find on my shelves down here. The Shadow and Bone series, the Grishaverse. I'm shocked that that's the first one, but I do record all the books I read and that does seem to be it. So I guess that was kind of my in into fantasy, which seems crazy to me. I feel like I've been a fantasy reader for so long, but I guess because I read so much urban fantasy and paranormal and things like that, that it took me a long time to actually get around to reading a full high fantasy series. The next question is, if you could be a hero or heroine in a fantasy book or series, what author would you want to write your series, and what would be a trope you really want included? I want to say I want my series written by Laini Taylor, but quite frankly I do not trust her. I feel like she takes far too much joy in slightly hurting readers, so I'm not sure that I would get out alive, or even if I did, I don't think I'd be in a particularly good state of mind, though honestly I think that is most fantasy books. But I am probably going to say Laini Taylor. I feel like just the majesty of the worlds she writes and the beautiful writing, I just want to be immersed in that in some way, so we're going to go with my favourite, Laini Taylor. And for a trope, I think it's going to have to be rivals to lovers. Absolutely. I need that tension. I need that just tension between me and someone, and the banter and the flirting that comes with it to then evolve into something really sweet. I think that's what we're going to go with. So Laini Taylor with rivals to lovers, which is honestly all the books that I've read from her, so that fits. The next question is, what is one fantasy book you've read this year that you want everyone else to read? And I am incapable of choosing one. So I've chosen 6, and I really didn't know what to choose because almost all the fantasy books I read because other people are talking about them and recommending them. So the majority of them are very widely spoken about and widely known, but we'll run through them anyway as I do have a different reason for each one. So starting off with an author I've spoken about a lot on this channel and read for the first time this year and have fallen in love with is TJ Klune. And I have 2 of his. The House in Cerulean Sea, if you want really wholesome adult fantasy that deals with some other really hard-hitting issues in a really gentle and lovely way, recommend that one. If you're looking for really fun YA urban fantasy with superheroes, I recommend The Extraordinaries. Both of these have LGBT rep, so they're both phenomenal. But I think The Extraordinaries especially is massively underread. I thought it was so good and so fun and just utterly hilarious, so I would highly recommend checking that one out if you haven't. Next is the book which I think of these is the most underrated, and that is The Infinite Noise by Lauren Shippen. This is actually kind of a novelization of a podcast series called The Bright Sessions, which I listen to, which is about these people who have extra abilities, kind of superhero-ish, And this is again an LGBT story. And as I said, it kind of is a novelization of the podcast, but it does also cover some extra content. So I definitely recommend checking this out, and you don't have to listen to the podcast to read this at all, but also listen to the podcast because it's great. Next is Docile by K.M. Sparer. This is a much, much darker adult sort of dystopian kind of sci-fi book. And this one I would say look into before you read it. It's definitely not for everyone, but I personally found it a really interesting sort of psychological book that really made you think about so many different things. And as I said, what is consent and can consent be given if you're in a really difficult situation, and all sorts of different things. It's a fascinating read, but do look into it before picking it up, as there are a lot of content warnings and trigger warnings, which I don't feel like I could list at this point because I did read it like 8 months ago. But look into it before picking it up because it's definitely darker than most. Next is actually my current read, and that is Daughter Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. We're back to Laini Taylor already, and I love this book so much. This is a YA fantasy, though it gets more adult as the series goes on, and it's so good. I'm currently only like 60 pages in of my reread, but I'm loving it so much. This is a kind of urban fantasy, though it gets more fantasy as the books go on because you leave the real world and stay in the other world, but the first book is urban fantasy. And it's so good. And angels and demons and all sorts of fantastical creatures. Phenomenal. And then finally is The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This is quite well read. A lot of people know of this book. But this is an amazing sort of historical, alternate historical fantasy with witches. It is again kind of urban fantasy because it is set primarily in an alternate version of our own world. So it feels very familiar. It has witches, it has gay witches. It's amazing, super feminist. Recommend it. So yeah, all of those. I've read all of those this year, and I think you should read all of them. The next question is, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? And I have so many answers for this, but to not repeat myself, we are going to go with Erin Morgenstern. I love both The Night Circus and The Starless Sea by her. Those are the only 2 books she's written so far, but I can guarantee that whatever she releases next and forever, I will read, as both of those books are 2 of my favourite books of all time, so I cannot for the life of me imagine an Erin Morgenstern book that I will not buy and absolutely love. Question 6 is, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? And I would definitely say the main place for me is actually Twitter. That's where I get most of my recommendations, because I do watch a lot of people's YouTube videos, and I will talk in a minute for a different question about some other content creators who I think give amazing fantasy recs. But I actually get most of my recs on Twitter because I don't always watch everyone's videos. I don't have time, but I do spend quite a lot of time scrolling through Twitter, and so I pick up a lot of recs through there. And I feel like, especially in the last year, the sort of adult fantasy and fantasy from different areas of the world that I've been coming across because of Twitter has been phenomenal and has exposed me to a whole wealth of recommendations that I cannot wait to get to. But it does make my TBR even longer, which I really do not need. The next question is, what is one fantasy release you are looking forward to? And this list could be endless, but the one I'm going to go with is one I just couldn't resist not mentioning, and that is In the Ravenous Dark by A.M. Strickland. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for this book. I'm not going to read you the whole synopsis, but I'm just going to read you like the tagline so that hopefully you can share in some of my obsession with this book. And that is, a pansexual blood mage reluctantly teams up with an undead spirit to start a rebellion among the living and the dead. And as far as I know, this has a pansexual blood mage, a lesbian love interest, an NB ace best friend, and a male-female-female polygamous relationship. I need this book so bad. Honestly, the amount of LGBT rep in this book, and it sounds amazing. I love the idea of blood mages and big battles, and oh, it sounds like my perfect book, and I am so unbelievably excited for it. I cannot even put it into words, but I think it's not coming out till like May or June of next year, which slightly hurts my soul. Yeah, 18th of May 2021. But I will be pre-ordering it and reading it very soon after it comes out, I am sure. A few others I'm excited for are the next TJ Klune book, which is called Under the Whispering Door, the next K.M. Sparer book, which is First Become Ashes, as well as so many others. I mean, I even want to say I'm excited for the next book in the Bone Season series by Samantha Shannon, even though I haven't even started that series yet. There's just so much hype surrounding it, and I personally can't wait, even for other people, so many, many books. The other one I've just remembered that I'm also very excited for, releasing in I think February of next year, is A Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth, because just reading from the author's own description, there are 4 queer main characters, but of the 5 main characters, this is the representation. 1 is questioning, later to be confirmed pansexual, 1 is lesbian, 1 is bisexual, 1 is gay, and 1 is gender fluid. Again, all the LGBT rep in fantasy. This is what we like to see. I am so excited for these just thoroughly queer fantasy books that we're getting. The next question is, what is one misconception about fantasy that you would like to lay to rest? And I think the biggest one for me is that not all fantasy is like medieval England in setting. A lot are, and a lot of it is set in that, where it's set in living in huts or living in castles with swords and longbows and all of that, and that's great, and if that's what you want to read, enjoy it. But there's so much more to it. There's straight fantasy that's set in a completely different world, and then on top of that there's paranormal and speculative and urban fantasy, which cover such a wealth of things, and me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the fantasy set in medieval settings. Some I will enjoy, but I find they get a bit old. It's not my preferred thing. I much prefer things that are either in an alternative setting or an urban fantasy or even looking to the future. That is much more what I tend to enjoy. So it's out there, just look for it. A lot of the classic, really classic fantasy may be that setting, and that's fine. So maybe Robin Hobb and Patrick Rothfuss and things like that, and even Brandon Sanderson from what I've read so far. But there is so much more sort of modern fantasy, which is a completely different setting. So if medieval fantasy is not your thing, you could still be a fantasy reader. Don't get put off just by that. And I specifically wanted to mention that because that's definitely something that used to put me off fantasy, because I knew that didn't appeal to me and I didn't realise how much else was out there. The next question is, if someone came to you asking for recommendations for where to start for fantasy, what are the first 3 books you would recommend? And I'm kind of going to talk about some books I've already spoken about. The first would be The House in the Cerulean Sea. This is because this is kind of an urban fantasy, but also just an alternate reality. So it has parts that mimic our world. It feels familiar, but it also feels very different. It's a very sweet story. It's a standalone. It's not too long, so it's very accessible for people who might be scared of the genre. And the focus is on the characters and the relationships between the characters instead of the fantasy elements. That's kind of just a side point. So it's not too overwhelming for someone who hasn't ever read fantasy at all. So I think this is a brilliant starting point, and I do actually kind of have that backed up with evidence that I made my mum read this and she absolutely loved it. So yeah, and she's not a fantasy reader at all, though I'm getting there. I'll get her one day. Next, I probably actually would recommend the Shadow and Bone series. Surprisingly, this is not a series I ever thought I'd really be recommending on my channel, but I do think it is actually a very good starting point. It's really accessible, the characters are really interesting, and also it's very well known. So if you want to really leap into the world and discuss it with people and see fan art and discussion of what relationships people like and what tropes people like and all of that, there is so much out there about this series, as it's so well known, that I think it's a really good option to start with. It's very easy to get into with it being YA, but it does have quite a pacey storyline and it's not too advanced or confusing. The magic system is very interesting but not too complex, and I honestly do just think it's a good series to start with, and I never thought I would be saying that. I think another really good starting point is the Every Heart and Doorway series by Sean and Maguire. This is a series of novellas, so they're all really short, so I think this could be a really good starting point, as again, it feels very accessible. You're not committing to too much. It's one really short, like under 200 pages book, so it's really easy to start with, and again, it's kind of an urban fantasy feel, and the kind of stories in this is to do with portal fantasy, so it's going through a door to another world, will feel familiar to a lot of people because of stories like Alice in Wonderland and Narnia. Even if you've not grown up reading, and even if you've not seen films of those, you will have an idea of those stories, falling down a rabbit hole or going through a wardrobe. And so a story like this will inherently probably feel quite familiar to a lot of people, and so it's probably quite a good starting point. And as I said, with a series of novellas, this is also a good way to explore a lot of different worlds and kind of get to grips with learning about a world, because that's quite a difficult thing for people who've not read fantasy before. They don't know how to learn about a world. It takes a while. So just, for example, me and my mum often buddy read books, and if we buddy read a fantasy book, she regularly is like, oh, what did that term mean? Or what does this mean? Who's this character? Whereas because I've read so much, I have learnt the ability to keep all that information stored, and so I don't have that problem. So by reading maybe a few of these books, you are experiencing lots of different worlds and you will start picking up those skills, so it's quite a good learning tool as well without having to commit to a huge series. Also, with the series very much following a different story in each book, it means it won't get repetitive, you won't be following all the same characters, there's a lot of different stories, so you can get a feel for what kind of thing you like whilst still sticking with one series. The next question is, who is the most recent fantasy sort of content creator you've come across who you'd want to shout out? And I don't really know who I've come across recently. I'm quite bad at just watching the same people over and over, as I don't have that much time to watch. I don't discover too many new people. But if you do have any fantasy content creators that you absolutely love, please let me know down in the comments, because I'm definitely looking for some new people to watch on BookTube or follow on Twitter. But the person I really want to shout out, because I feel like she's really underrated for her fantasy, is Shanice Noel. and of course she'll be linked down below. I love her channel so much, I love her content, and she reads a lot of fantasy, and she reads quite a good mix of the really classic fantasy as well as a lot more recent and adult and YA fantasy. And I love her videos, and every time she talks about a series, I just really want to pick it up, and so highly recommend her. Just to rattle off a few others, obviously Katie from Brightness Katie Reads, especially if you want really classic fantasy, she is the place to go. If you want some more contemporary fantasy, especially fantasy by Chinese authors or other Asian authors, I would definitely check out Tammy at Tammy Tries to Read. She has actually just put up a video, which I'll link below, which is fantasy books from Chinese diaspora authors. So that's a brilliant place to check out if you want to like broaden the sort of fantasy you're reading and make it much less sort of US and UK centric. So those are some other people I would highly recommend checking out. One other I would say, who I'm sure everyone already knows, is Becca from Becca in the Books. If you want fantasy romance, that is the place to go for fantasy romance. Could not recommend it more. She has introduced me to some phenomenal fantasy romance series, and I'm definitely going to be picking up more of her recommendations in future. So that is it. That is all the questions. I'm not tagging everyone because I'm pretty sure all the fantasy readers I know have already done this video, but I really enjoyed doing it. I love discussing sort of how I came to read what I read and hopefully getting other people started on fantasy. I don't solely read fantasy at all. I read a lot of contemporary, I read dystopian, I read anything honestly, so it's just nice to be able to talk about one facet of that for a minute. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a thumbs up, comment down below your thoughts. As I said, any creators you do know, I would love to check them out. Subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. All my other social medias, book clubs and read-alongs I host are all linked down below in the description as they always are. But that is it for this video, so bye, and I'll see you in the next one.